CDataArc is an enterprise B2B automation platform that includes any-to-any data transformation and mapping. In this video, we'll look at some recent improvements to the XML map connector, which is the core data transformation tool in Arc. Those updates are 1. Improved conditional mapping logic, 2. Storing and referencing variables while mapping, and 3. Testing your mapping changes. Conditional logic is an important part of sophisticated data transformation. That's why the condition builder in the XML map connector received an upgrade in Arc's latest release. Let's look at a simple example of conditional logic to show off what's new, and don't worry if the specifics of this example don't match your use case, as the same principles apply no matter what logic you need to implement. Let's say I'm mapping EDI purchase order data into my backend database, and I know that sometimes the item name for purchased items is empty. In this case, I want to use the item SKU, or item ID, as the item name field. To get started, I'll try mapping the item name field like usual, which is PO110 in my EDI data. Now I want to add conditional logic for the case where this PO110 element is empty. I'll click this condition option from the hover menu to bring up the condition builder. I can give the condition a quick name so I can save and reference it later in my mappings. In this case, item name not empty is a pretty good descriptive name for our condition. Then I can click Add Rule to begin defining my condition rule. This first dropdown determines whether I'm looking at the EDI data itself, modeled as XML for mapping, or at the metadata associated with the EDI in the form of message headers. Right now, and most commonly, we're dealing with the data itself, so we'll keep input XML for this option. The second dropdown allows me to define what kind of condition I need, whether that's checking for specific values, checking whether certain values occur the expected number of times, whether elements are the correct data type, and so on. In this simple example, we're just checking for a value not being empty, so we'll leave value for this option. The third dropdown allows me to select what value in the EDI data I'm interested in, which in this case is the item name, or PO110. Now I can set the logical operator itself, which in this case should be isNotEmpty. And with that, we've defined our logic rule. Check whether the value in PO110, which is the item name, is empty. Now we can use the panel on the right to define behavior depending on whether this logic rule is satisfied or not. So if the item name is not empty and this condition is satisfied, then we map the value as usual and the status remains a success and we don't need to send anyone a notification. But now if the logic rule is not satisfied, so if PO110 is empty, we have some options. We can exclude this element in our output, we can map the empty value anyway, or we can choose a different value to map to this element. We'll return to the different element in the mapping editor, but first we can also see that we have the ability to change the status of the mapping if the condition fails, to warning or to error, and we could send a notification to a system admin using the notification settings configured globally in Arc. In this example though, it makes sense to just leave everything here as it is. Back in the mapping editor, we can see this else branch as the result of the condition that we just built. In the case where the item name is empty, we want to use the item SKU, or PO107, as the item name. So I can simply drag and drop that value as usual to map to this else condition. And with that, we've implemented some simple conditional logic in Arc, while getting a glimpse of how these same principles can be extended to perform more advanced logical operations on your data or metadata. Some mappings benefit from the ability to store and reference variables in the mapping. Variables allow you to calculate or store a value, and then reference that value later, or in multiple places, in the mapping. A common example of this comes up when generating outbound EDI purchase orders or invoices. Purchase orders and invoices may include multiple line items, and one of the last segments of an EDI purchase order, the CTT segment, contains the number of line items. You can count the number of line items as you're mapping line item data, then save that count as a variable, and then reference that counter later in the CTT segment when you need it. To accomplish this, I'm first going to head to the PO1 loop section of the mapping. This is where line item data is contained. I know that Arc will loop through each of the line items present in my input and create a new PO1 loop section for each of these line items. Counting the number of line items is therefore equivalent to counting the number of loops. If I count the number of loops and store that value in a variable, I can use that variable later in the CTT segment. First, I'll create a new variable node by right-clicking in the output panel. I'll give the variable a name, like item count, and then open up the expression editor for this variable to set its value. Counting the number of loops simply requires accessing the special index value using this underscore index within square brackets. After looping through all of the line items, the index value will be the same as the total number of loops, so this variable will contain the total number of loops. Now that I've set the value of my variable, I can simply reference that variable in the CTT segment. In the expression editor for CTT01, I can use the Variable tab to choose the variable that I just defined. And with that, I can be assured that the total number of line items will be present here in CTT01 after being calculated earlier in the mapping. The last improvement to the XML map connector that we'll be examining is the ability to test your mappings. After you've made an edit to your mapping configuration, you can simply click this Test Mapping button to see what effects your change will have on your output. The Test Play button at the top tells Arc to actually run the mapping and generate a model of the output. The XML map connector will attempt to use any source templates for your mapping to generate test output data. In this case, we can test the CTT01 mapping that I just created to see the value of 1 show up in our test output. This is because the source template for the mapping included just one line item. You can use this output to quickly determine if your mapping configuration is accomplishing what you expect as you make changes. So that covers 3 major updates to the XML map connector in Arc's latest release: improved conditionals, variables, and map testing. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. And as always, you can find more resources at arc.cdata.com.